Florence Planning and Zoning meeting. This is a regular meeting. Mr. Harmon, would you take the roll, please?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Pranzo.
Present.
Vice Chair Frost.
Present.
Commissioner Schopel.
Present.
And Commissioner Schmidt. I have not heard from him, one way or the other. Yeah.
Do we have a quorum?
But you have a quorum.
Thank you,
Sorry.
sir. Would you please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, moving right along. This is discussion, approval, disapproval of the minutes of the regular meeting conducted on April 19th, 2018. I'll open it up to the commission. Do we have any comments?
I move that the meeting's minutes be approved as presented to us.
I'll second that motion.
I have a, excuse me, gentlemen. I have a, I'm losing my words. I have a motion by Commissioner Schopel, second by Commissioner Frost, or Vice Chairman Frost. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? The minutes are accepted. New business, discussion and motion to proceed with development code amendments. This is a presentation for approval or disapproval. Request by the town of Florence as the applicant to initiate development code text amendments. The various sections of the development code of the town of Florence for modifying applicable sections to address changes in technology, legal mandates, and contemporary land use standards. Mr. Harmon, do we have a presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. As you're aware, the development code has come into question on various topics of late. And as part of that, and part of my charge when I started here, was to look at the code, see what needs updated, et cetera. Some of this work has begun, but typically it's appropriate to have the Planning Commission or the Town Council to actually initiate the amendment rather than the staff doing it themselves. So I'm bringing it to you tonight, walking you through what we're looking at, and hopefully get your endorsement to continue and proceed. There's a number of needs why that relate to your code and why it should be updated. First of all, there's been new legislation as recently as this last session that needs to be addressed, and some some statutory attempts that didn't pass this time, but I suspect are going to come back in the next session and in the future until it does pass. Some of them got rather controversial, and they did a lot of amendments, but the session ran out of time before they got them complete. I expect them fully to come back. Also, some recent court rulings, as recent as this week. Supreme Court has now legalized, or allowed states, rather, to manage off-track betting on sports betting facilities, as well as just on horse racing. If depending on what happens at our legislative level, we may be getting applications for sports bars and taverns and places like that to run off-track betting, and we want to address that in the development code as to where it's appropriate for that type of use to take place. Also, just general ambiguities and inconsistencies in the code that just in my short time here, looking up certain definitions or processing certain types of applications, not getting a really definitive answer to zoning questions as they're presented to us, or even just general information over the telephone. Cross-referencing throughout the code, there are areas where it's lacking, where one type of answer is given, but if you read 3 sections down, it's actually contradicted or not properly cross-referenced, so that you are not getting a comprehensive answer to the questions as you're proceeding through the code. And then just current development issues as they take place, making sure that we have as most modern code as we can have related to any type of development issue, from just general site plan layout to how we handle PUDs, et cetera. So some of this is going to be nothing more than just a good review and possible tweaking. In other areas, we're looking at some significant updates or amendments coming through. For example, of new legislation, recent court rulings, small cell wireless, mandated by state law, and actually was initiated through the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, it's a different type of wireless networking. In lieu of the traditional cell towers, which were very controversial when they started up in mass about, well, it's been 20 years ago now, plus or minus. The small cell wireless is a more compact method of transferring air data, electronic wireless data. And we'd like to make sure our codes address that in detail, right down to the permitting process and fees that the town can exact. State law has actually limited the fees that we can have on permitting of those types of facilities. Short-term rentals, that's one that has been controversial, what they call the Airbud, or the Airbnbs. Right now there is a case pending between the city of Sedona and the state of Arizona on how they can be managed, and if they can be managed by the communities. We want to make sure we're current in that area. Land use definitions. Yes, sir.
Please.
If I may, can you just tell me what a short-term rental is? So I think I understand what that is, but sometimes the titles are a little bit ambiguous.
Vice Chair Frost, basically that is a kind of like a vacation rental of a private facility that's less than 30 days. There's more definitive definition, but that's the short version. Signs within the right-of-way, another Supreme Court case, City of Gilbert, Town of Gilbert. They're still a town. Town of Gilbert versus one of their local churches ended up in the Supreme Court on what type of verbiage and restrictions can be put on signs that are placed in the right-of-way. We run into this during election season, of course, with campaign signs, real estate signs. The church in this case was restricted on the type of verbiage and use of right-of-way signage. The court has ruled that it all has to be allowed and the same. So we need to make sure our code is compliant with that through the sign code area. Off-track betting I mentioned. Sober living homes, that's become another area of great discussion. City of Phoenix just passed a sober living quarters, and it's coming under a kind of a little bit different definition than group homes and rehab facilities and things like that. We want to make sure we're covered for those also, so that they don't start showing up in mass in neighborhoods. And we'll get into that in more detail in the near future. Ambiguous language is just what it says. It applies generally to definitions, but there's also other areas in the code that we need to clear it up. But just responding to certain like home occupation requests for business license and certain land use types, the code does not really address things in a degree of specificity that makes it easy to enforce. So when I get certain questions, I'm finding I'm having to kind of almost on the spot detail define certain terms and things like that, and that isn't the way the code should work. It should be much more black and white than that, and take out a lot of the room for interpretation. Cross-referencing, same thing. Just make sure that the various sections of the code are cross-referenced for consistency and ease of use itself. If one section refers to another, we want to make sure that they are compatible. A great example landed on my desk today, and although it impacted the actual town code, but the definition of a kennel in the development code is one animal difference than the definition of a kennel in our animal control code. And we want to make sure those are compatible with each other before we start giving out information to the public on what constitutes a kennel, what constitutes a pet in your backyard.
Okay.
Whoops. One too many.
Can I ask a question? You mentioned the Supreme Court has allowed sports gambling, and you said that some consideration has to be given to the formulation of allowing that in certain bars and so forth. I'm not certain what the state's position is or the town's position on medical marijuana. Is that something that is in the code, or I'm not familiar with what the state's position or the town's position is on that.
Commissioner Schopel, there's actually an entire section of the codes of our town code that addresses medical marijuana. There was a state mandate a few years ago through legislation that you had to address it in your codes, and you could put certain restrictions on where it's located and how sites are developed and secured and things like that. You could not prohibit it. And so our code already takes care of that. As far as the sports betting, that was a result, this goes back 30 plus years, but currently when the law was passed at the national level, federal level, it gave Las Vegas the exemption to allow certain types of sports betting. New Jersey, I believe it was, sued over that and filed suit, and because of Atlantic City, and that's kind of where the Supreme Court basically overturned the federal legislation and has now given to each state the ability to regulate sports betting. We already had the ability to regulate off-track betting for horses. Like you go out to Turf Paradise, you can bet on races at Pimlico and Belmont and every place else. But this expands it into the area of sports betting. Now, what the state is going to do, because that ruling just came down earlier this week, what the state will do legislatively, we'll have to wait till next session and find out. But we want to be prepared for it, and we can do it, I think, in just general terms and address it as off-track betting to include, and we'll get that into the code. Now, that doesn't mean that we might not have to modify that a little bit if legislation does go through and how it's worded, but we'd rather be ahead of the curve and have to fix something rather than have to start from scratch, and in the meantime not having regulations for businesses trying to open with that type of facility. So,
Okay, thank you.
certainly. New technologies, that's kind of self-explanatory. Technology for development, solar, all types of things are changing on a regular basis, and we just want to make sure that our code is current in those areas. Solar has been something that we're processing 25 permits a month maybe right now just for solar installations, individual private solar installations. But even that technology is changing. I know recently any place that has mission tile type roofs, the curved mission tile, there is now solar panels, if you will, coverings in that same shape that actually can be covered over mission tile to have the same design profile, although a black color instead of, the mission tile red. I'm not even sure if we're aware of it in-house, but those types of technologies are changing regularly, as well as wireless communication and some other things. We want to make sure we're as current as possible. New housing types. One of the new areas that are becoming popular across the country, and there are codes, examples all over, including now in Arizona, for what they call tiny homes. It's kind of like a park model, but in that it can be moved around, but they are custom built rather than a mass-produced single type of product. And so we have no discussion of it in our code one way or another. It doesn't fall under park models or mobile homes or recreational vehicles because of the type of licensing that goes on them. So they're built more to applicable building codes, even though they're on a chassis with wheels. So it's an area we haven't really addressed because there's been no reason to up till now, but the industry has changed. There are facilities going in right now at ASU or just off campus by private developers for what they're calling tiny home living areas. Just general accepted development practices, we're going to reach out to other communities that have experienced heavy growth and new techniques and make sure that we're on the same playing field as they are. Driverless vehicle parking and charging stations. Charging stations for electric vehicles. I think Chandler just recently adopted an update to their parking code related to driverless vehicles. Whether you like them or not, they're out there and they're looks like they're coming. It's interesting, the number one test community in the state right now for driverless vehicles is Arizona City. which is not incorporated, it's just outside of Eloy, but there are a lot of vehicles in that community right now, more like a community bus transit type system, but that's a testing area down there because of the way the terrain is and the street system is, and it seems to be something that we're going to have to face at some point. Charging stations are obvious, the more Teslas and everybody else who has some type of electronic or electric vehicle are looking for charging stations. The town hall in Wickenburg, for example, I think has about a half a dozen electric charging stations right at the town hall parking lot, right next to the handicap ones. So, it's technology we want to make sure that we address in our various codes. And then just signs and parking, permanent and temporary. These are definitely a current issue. There's been a temporary sign code sitting on the website now for 2 years that has had no activity. We've resuscitated it, are taking a look at it to making sure it's current, and we'll be getting it out for review sometime in the near future, we hope. The same with parking. We've, quite frankly, have just finished a draft text update to our current parking code to get it more current and more comprehensive. It's still in internal review. These are things, though, that the Commission will be seeing in work session in the relatively near future.
Forgive me, I should probably know this as a member of the Planning and Zoning Commission, but can you tell me the procedure on how code violations are identified? And
Mike, I'm sorry, if we could do that after.
okay,
We're getting off of the...
okay, very good, thank you.
I got to stick to the script.
Okay, very good.
I've kind of broken these up into what I consider priority needs based on just 3 months of experience and what I'm seeing, as well as visiting with our code enforcement officer, visiting with our contract planner, Dana Burkhart, and other staff members who have been here longer. And so what I'm basically looking at, recommending, is we attack signs, temporary and permanent, parking, temporary and permanent, permitted land use tables, definitions, administrative procedures, and then the small cell wireless that I've identified earlier as basically our first priorities to go after and try to get current and updated. These will be the items that I think we're going to be using the most in the very near future, and we want to be as modern and current as we can. Second priority area, just general provisions, outdoor lighting, landscaping. Yes, sir.
About 2 years ago, probably, maybe a little bit more. I'm getting older, so time goes fast. We wrestled really, really hard with the sign code. We brought in consultants. We brought in sign makers. We brought in merchants within the community. Oh, shit. We've done a lot of work in sign code. Are you telling me that we've become antiquated now?
The sign code that was reviewed several years back was never adopted.
Is that right?
That's correct. That's been on the website for comments for several years. And so what we're doing is resuscitating
that. We just went through that Chinese fire drill, didn't we?
Yeah.
Yes.
So we're bringing it back up. I'm not looking at wholesale changes to what you have done already.
I hope not, because...
No, we're not going to recreate the wheel by any means here.
Yeah,
but it needs to get adopted. It's just kind of languishing out there.
Well, I'd like to see it get in front of council and get done. We put a lot of time and effort, not only by staff, by volunteers and people in the industry. It's a pretty damn good code.
Yeah, and I don't think we're looking at any kind of wholesale changes. We just want to make sure we're current, like I mentioned before, with the right-of-way signage that went through the court system, things like that. And then we'll be bringing it forward again to get it into the work session, public hearing, and adoption process.
Great. I'd like to see it.
Second priority areas, in my mind, are just the general provisions. Outdoor lighting, landscaping, walls and fences, swimming pools, height and area regulations. I've listed those 5 because those are the ones that are currently in the code listed under general provisions. Whether or not they need any major changes to them is yet to be seen. Lighting is one that we definitely want to make sure we're current in technology. But the landscaping, the walls, fences, swimming pools, those are things just to kind of visit and make sure everybody's happy with what's in there. We'll probably make a few suggestions for you to consider as far as updates or changes might be. And the same with height and area regulations. For example, in certain zoning classifications now, you do not have a maximum building area or site coverage. It's just basically you can completely fill up a site as long as you meet the setbacks. Practically, that doesn't work by the time you do on-site parking and other types of things. So we want to revisit it and see if there's a better way for that to be presented in the code for people to look at, especially for commercial, multifamily, and industrial type development. Not so much single family. We may even have the discussion on what's referred to as FARs, floor area ratios, rather than a lot coverage, and that's a lengthy discussion we'll do later. It might be an easier way, though, to address that particular discussion and issue. And then what I consider the third priority is just general development standards for each category. Make sure that we, are consistent for the different intensity of land uses. What I consider what a lot of people call pyramidal zoning. In other words, the lower intensity regulations are intensified the more intense the land use it is. So from rural residential into industrial. So to make sure that we have the best regulation to manage the development process as these types of proposals come forward, so that the town ultimately is happy with the type of proposal that you that you get in the end, the resulting of those development standards. So just looking at maybe more detail, improve the cross-referencing, and then wherever is appropriate to update development standards. We'll be bringing some suggestions forward to you, but in the course of work sessions, basically brainstorming with the commission on where you see flaws or where we see lacking of detailed standards and things of that nature. So, this will be one of the last things that we attack, I think, in the code itself. Because if we can get definitions locked up and other types of things, it will start curing any ails that we might have elsewhere in the code. And then things that we'll maybe consider while we're going through all this, really address crime prevention through environmental design, CPTED. That is a program that's been around now for a little bit over 40 years, where there's ways of mitigating crime issues or potential crime issues through the type of design and site planning that's done, landscape materials, where they're placed, things of that nature. This is a program that I take a lot of pride in personally, because I helped write the first national code back in the mid-'70s. And I've already had discussion with fire department, and we will also have discussion with PD on how they see that type of code helping their efforts in the field. Administrative reviews and administrative conditional use permits, I've already talked to the town attorney to maybe simplify approval processes on simple projects and doing administrative approvals more so, just to make it easier, especially for the the private homeowner trying to do things, or small businesses to get up and started, to help mitigate the lengthy approval process it takes and review process. A lot of that is going to be built on faith between you all and the council and staff, but I think those are areas that really need to be considered in a development code. And then anything else that's identified throughout the process. As we work with the commission and the council on work sessions and public hearings, things are going to come to light that we haven't even thought of yet. And we just want to make sure that everybody's aware of that, and we'll be in a position to address them as they move forward.
Questions and comments? I don't have any questions. I'm trying to remember the last time we did this. I think it was about 4 years ago, maybe longer. I remember this coming in front of us before. It's just a constant update. Stay ahead of the curve. The most important thing is that it remains in the public realm, that people are aware of what we're doing. Other than that, I applaud your effort. You put a lot of work into that. You made one hell of a work list.
There's a lot to be done, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. One thing about codes, and if it's been 4 years, let's say, since you've looked at anything, that's 3 years too long. code needs some type of evaluation annually, in my mind, once you have it where you want it to be. Because things change. It's that simple. Or you face issues. So far, since I've been here, and I haven't, and going back through the records, I'm not seeing a lot of activity for Board of Adjustment. And that's a good thing. But I know in a lot of communities, in my experience, you start getting a Board of Adjustment request for a particular issue over and over, then maybe there's something wrong with your code, you need to fix it. Those are the types of things that are triggers. But just an annual review, just even if it's a general discussion with the commission on new technology or new types of development that you've seen elsewhere, to talk about, is that something that we want to pursue in the code?
Well, I agree with you, and I think on an annual review is an excellent idea because it keeps the people who are applying these codes up to speed on what the actual intent is. Quite often, I know I'm guilty, I'll go to the letter of the code and overshoot the intent. So, yeah, I'd like to see that happen as well. I'd like to open up to the commission if they have any questions.
How would a resident avail themselves of the new codes? Would it be on a website, the town website, or could they come and get a copy if they need to, or people who do work in various areas, contractors as an example, especially like a place like Anthem, where contractors are doing things on a regular basis? How would they avail themselves of the new codes?
Commissioner Schopel, actually we have, in our current code, we have a prescribed process for code review. However, we typically go beyond that, or I typically go beyond that. I'll give you an example right now would be the small cell wireless. That has been kind of in the works for a few months. There's been a staff review internally of a draft to address it. We've already sent it out to what we consider stakeholders, which are the companies who deal in that industry specifically, and actually are receiving some comments back. The next step would be for public outreach. We're starting to set that calendar right now. Maybe, I'm not sure if we'll do 1 or 2 meetings, but it'll be publicized typically in the water bill or wherever. And I think we're looking at doing at least one in the community center or in this facility, and then possibly one out in the Anthem Merrill Ranch area also. And then it'll be a work study or a workshop with the commission, and then a public hearing with the commission, and then it would be, which is you recommend then to the town council, and then it'll be up to the council whether or not they want to do a workshop prior to them having a public hearing for adoption. So there'll be a lot of outreach. Now, while that's all going on, once it becomes a public document, it will be on the website. We'll post it there for public review and solicit comments. Comments would be directed back to staff, usually via email. If somebody wants to submit them in hard copy writing, that's fine too. But we try to, go over and above what the code currently requires as far as public outreach, just to make sure we're as comprehensive as possible in our review process.
Thank you.
Mr. Frost?
Is that better? Yeah. Kind of one of the new buzzwords in the industry seems to be low impact development. And how is that being embraced or shunned by Florence?
Vice Chair Frost, I'm trying to think of a diplomatic way to answer. Every few years, there's a new buzzword.
Right.
Form-based zoning was one about 5-6 years ago. That's the current one. And they all basically mean the same thing. And that's the kind of the goal is you're looking at trying to develop or put together development standards that result in product that is low impact on the environment, low impact on traffic generation, low impact, all across the board. And that's been the nature of development codes, I would say, for the last 25 to 30 years. They've been progressing more and more towards a low impact. And environmental impact is the current. And traffic, I think, as a whole, for air quality issues, obviously. And so, yes, that's part of our, when we look at how we're going to recommend changes to the development code, that's going to be taken into consideration.
And I guess what's making this cycle, I guess, if you will, a little bit different for me is viewing stormwater as a resource to help supplement watering and et cetera of Sonoran adapted vegetation versus using potable water for 100% of the water supply, and not just taking that water and sticking it in a basin, but trying to put it to some sort of productive use, which and I think that's probably one of the better things that's coming out of this cycle of low impact development, or whatever the current buzzword is. And
that's actually one of the things we've already talked about internally, Dana and myself. For example, on required parking for large-scale developments. That's a massive sea of asphalt. And we, of course, require retention areas to get water back, groundwater back in. But at the same time, a lot of communities are going to allowing maybe a 20% of the parking area to allow a more pervious surfacing technique, for the parking that's furthest from the building, to help capture some of that stormwater and let it percolate back into the groundwater system. We want to look at those technologies that are out there and possibly incorporate those also. So that's one of, we're looking into it, yes.
I think all that, we can learn a good lesson from our neighbors to the northwest about the heat island effect and getting ahead of the curve and putting a lot of trees in. That's my first question. Second question deals with planning, basically, now that we're kind of starting to get hints and seeing alignments of the future freeway that's going to come down through our midst, and which I, having lived through that before, will probably change the way we do business, the complexion of the area, and do a lot of, it has the potential to do an immense amount of good. Where are we in getting ahead of that planning curve?
Actually, that'll be discussed very briefly under 6B.
Ooh, okay, I'll hold that question then, thank you.
Anything else? No. All right, well, this is for approval or disapproval, so I need a motion. Or I'll make a motion to approve the request by the town of Florence to initiate development code text amendments. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay. We have a unanimous second by both Commissioner Schappel and Vice Chair Frost. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carried. Okay. And for our next event, we have a presentation by Development Services. Overlay zone status and a 2030 general plan update. Mr. Harmon.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, we talked to you a few meetings ago regarding overlay zones and the benefit of them. There is actually one underway. That's what initiated that discussion. It's for the Florence Gardens subdivision. There has been some issues that have surfaced out there repeatedly that I'm back to what I talked about earlier. If you have a certain situation that keeps coming back, maybe there's something wrong in the code itself or some way of addressing it specifically for that development. That's what we're doing now. We've done a draft addressing some of the concerns that they've had regarding fence heights and some other things. It's actually, they have a documents review committee within their organization, and it's actually in their hands to review right now. And when I get that back, we'll be putting it into a form to bring it to you for a work session and then move forward, hopefully, for adoption. What it'll do, I think, if it goes through, it's going to alleviate a lot of situations that we've had to deal with code enforcement and some other permit issues or lack thereof on some things that have been occurring out there. So that's going to be our first overture into that type of an overlay zone, and we'll bring that to you as soon as it's in a proper form to do so.
Did I hear you say permit issues?
There's been a few things happen without permits out there because we have had a contractor apparently from out of town who's been telling the people out there they didn't need one and that he would take care of all the issues, and is doing some installations that quite frankly are not we don't know if they're up to code or not. We have not inspected them yet, but they weren't even permitted by our code to allow them to even build the type of structure that they did.
Well, that sounds like...
Turns out some of the residents actually wanted to proceed with these, and so we're trying to get the permissibility through so that they actually can control it more directly with building codes and put everybody on notice that it indeed requires a building permit in order to execute the project.
Just a heads up, though, the how do I put it? People are talking about how long it takes to actually get a permit. So something to put in the back of your mind, because I know of several instances where people have just avoided doing work because they'd rather not go through the permit process. Some of the rumors are vicious, almost unbelievable, but they're out there, so keep them in the back of your mind.
Will do.
Okay. Do we have more, Mr. Harmon?
On the overlay?
Overlay, right.
No, that's basically it. I just wanted to get you current so that you knew that there was one coming forward.
Okay. Do we have any questions about the overlay?
I have no questions.
Good. And then we move on to 2030 general plan update status.
State statute mandates that every community update their general plan every 10 years. Ours, of course, is the 2020 general plan. We're initiating the process now because it is a relatively lengthy process to update a general plan, not only from the work itself, but also for the adoption process. It'll require a vote during a general election or a special election. So we were trying to get out in front of it. A request for qualifications has been drafted. It's in staff review right now. It's also a part of the upcoming 2018-19 budget cycle. There's an allocation for hiring a consultant or consultant team to update the plan itself. And once I get comments back to finalize the RFQ, the request for qualifications, and get the go-ahead from administration, we'll be putting it out on the street. So that work will be moving forward. We have identified very specifically in the work product that they need to address the north-south corridor study, and depending on how far along it is, how many lanes or how many alignments we can narrow it down to. There's also some very specific information placed in the RFQ with giving them direction on the type of information we're looking for in the update. I think we're anticipating this to be a fairly specific and comprehensive document, maybe even more so than the one that you have now, because of some changes that have happened more recently. We want to address the potential of Santan incorporating, for example, and what would happen to our planning area should that happen, and how would we address it in the plan, things of that nature. So we're laying that all out pretty comprehensively, and as soon as possible we'll put it on the street, and that has a intensive public review process, public hearing process. We're programming into it a minimum of 20 public meetings. We may increase that number before it hits the street, but that's kind of where we're starting right now.
Do you see a lot of change in the general plan that we presented? I guess that must be 10 years ago?
Yeah, you adopted it in, I think the election was 2010.
Yeah.
It was formulated in 2009. I don't see a significant amount of change. I think we just want to make sure that we're current with all the various studies that are going on. For example, there's a Parks and Recreation is preparing a new bicycle pedestrian master plan, updating their recreation and open space plan. We have a transportation plan update underway right now. All of those would be incorporated. Any new findings or additional findings would be incorporated.
Right.
That the basic plan itself, I think, is pretty strong. So it's just a matter of being current as we can.
We put a lot of work into it at the time. It was rather a unique situation for us. Our town manager at the time, Matsu Patel, was a professional planner. And we had hired a professional planner as a director of planning and zoning. And so we had two planners overseeing our last general plan. And I have to say, it worked out pretty well. It was a giant leap forward for Florence at the time to put that much sophistication and effort into the general plan. So it'll be interesting to see what we look like with the new plan or with the revised plan.
Mr. Chairman, I think that our staff oversight on this will be equally as detailed, significant, and comprehensive.
Well, I hope so. Should I open to the committee? Are you done?
I'm finished. Thank you, sir.
We have any questions?
Any questions?
This is simply a presentation, so unless you have more, I will move on if I can find the next sheet. Here we go. Call to the public. Call the public for public comment on issues within the jurisdiction of the Planning and Zoning Commission. Individual commission members may respond to criticisms made, may ask staff to review a matter raised, or may ask that a matter be put on a future agenda. However, members of the commission shall not discuss or take action on any matter during an open call to the public unless the matters are properly noticed for discussion and legal action. And what that simply means is if it's not on the agenda, we can't talk. Do we have any comments or questions from the public? Then I will close the call to the public, and I will open it to the commission. Do we have any current events?
No current events.
I'm not sure this qualifies as a current event, but it currently happens every time I sit up here. I can't hardly hear. Has anybody,
Yes.
have you ever looked at the acoustics up of this room?
It's hard to hear him.
Yeah, it's terrible. We have a weird, like, echo up here.
Yeah.
Very hard to hear you when you make presentations.
This room has needed soft walls
Yeah.
since it was built.
So I would highly recommend we do something. It's got to be the same when the council sits up here. Man, it's tough to hear up here. So that's my,
Speakers.
oh. Yeah, maybe I'll have to try that because it's bad. Okay.
Commissioner Frost, Mr. Harmon may have access to them, or the gentleman up in the booth. There's a hearing aid that is by Motorola that the town has that is on the same frequency as these microphones. And I used it before I had hearing aids, and it really does work. You'll hear who's ever talking in a microphone will come across crystal clear.
That would be helpful to me as well.
Well then, 2 if you can find them.
Well, and I hear just fine. It's just this weird echo I get up here. I'll try the speakers here and see what they do next time around. I didn't realize that's what for.
Yes. There's no sound attenuation here at all.
Okay, that was my current event because I currently have a hard time hearing you. So.
Do we have anything else? All right then, I'd like a motion to adjourn.
I second.
I have a motion by Vice Chairman Frost, second by Chairman Chappell. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? We are adjourned.